Just making sure.
As well, because the music's driving me nuts.
All right.
Yeah, play some Twin Temple, bro. You should listen to more Twin Temple themes. I think you'd love like the style.
The style of Twin Temples.
Yeah.
The music should be off for everybody, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't hear it anymore.
Yeah, you don't. You should not hear it anymore. And we're gonna do this.
Ooh, that kind of hurts my eyes now.
All right. And then I'm going to mute everybody except for the two debaters. Can you two talk? Can I hear you guys?
Yep.
Hey.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Anybody else over there? Can you hear? No,
Cool,
nobody
I got
talking?
everything set up.
All right, good. All right, good. All right, let's get started on this.
Shoot. My bad.
Ban this guy.
Right. Why are you holding your hand up?
You win.
You can't hear somebody? Let's turn this on. Who can't you hear?
I can't hear the two debaters.
Can you hear me right now?
Not when you have that setting. Oh, I didn't know
Uh-huh.
you all toggled were on. talking. Yeah, now I can hear you.
Oh.
When you had
Okay.
that setting toggled, we couldn't hear them.
Okay,
Oh.
so then that means only friends only can talk, but it doesn't mean that. Okay, then you know what? I'll just have everybody mute their mics instead. Thanks for that. I appreciate that, Carrera. Good job. All right. Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Happy Mardi Gras. On the very night the Christian calendar pivots towards Lent, a season that culminates in crucifixion and resurrection, we're debating the final chapter first. Tonight's debate question is, did Jesus resurrect from the dead? The resolution is, it is more likely than not that Jesus of Nazareth rose bodily from the dead. My role tonight is strictly procedural. I'm not here to argue, debate, or express personal opinions. My responsibility is to enforce time limits, maintain professionalism, and ensure both speakers receive equal and exact time. Before we begin, a few expectations from our audience. You must remain silent. I think I've got a little graphic for you all. There we go. You must remain silent. No interruptions, verbal reactions, commentary, or sound effects. No gesturing at speakers in a disruptive way. No private voice side conversations in the room. If you are removed for disruption, you may not return. Essentially, please, everybody, just mute your mics. This is a formal debate, not an open discussion forum. If you crash out or disconnect from big screen, the room code to re-enter is Yellow King 659. I would write that down in case you don't get it. Please rejoin quietly if that happens. Audience participation will only occur during the designated Q&A segment at the end. Thank you for helping keep this professional. Also, in the event that a debater or I experience a technical disconnection or crash, we will pause the debate and allow time for reconnection. If a crash occurs, the timer will be paused immediately. No one will continue speaking, and we will wait up to 5 minutes for reconnection. If reconnection is not possible within that window, I will make a procedural decision on how to proceed. Okay, we're up to debate. The two people here, Collin with the affirmative argument and Cortez with the negative argument. We will now begin opening statements. Each speaker will have 15 minutes uninterrupted. There will be a 1-minute warning before time expires, and then when time is up, I will ask you to conclude your sentence. It sounds like you guys will be under anyways, so we don't have to worry about that. Collin, are you ready?
I'm ready. Let me hop up.
All right, go on up. The affirmative, you have 15 minutes, and your time starts when you begin to speak.
All right. Is the most likely conclusion surrounding the fate of Jesus of Nazareth that he rose bodily from the dead? That's the question tonight. I want to invite you to consider one thing throughout this debate. Whose story will explain the historical evidence we have, and whose will raise even more difficult historical questions while attempting to explain the first? Or in the terms of historian, which story has more explanatory scope and power, meaning that it explains more of the data more simply, and which is less ad hoc, meaning it requires less unevidenced assumptions? I will be defending the resurrection of Jesus as a historical event tonight by putting forward the argument that Jesus' earliest followers used, which is simply that he appeared to them in bodily form. I would do this by asking 5 questions. If an affirmative answer is more probable than not for each of these questions, then I will have defended the resurrection more probably than not really did happen. The first question is, 1, did Jesus die on the cross? Since virtually all historians accept this as historically certain, I won't spend my time on it tonight unless it is questioned by my opponent. The second question is, 2, were there people who were in a position to know if Jesus resurrected who claimed that he did? To answer no to this question, one would have to defend the claim that our sources for the witnesses of the resurrection in the first century are legendary. That is, they were written much later by authors who are not in a position to know much about the actual events surrounding Jesus' death and alleged resurrection. This is a more popular claim, so I'll spend some time on it. 2 reasons why you should believe that there were people who could have known the facts that claim that Jesus had resurrected are that 1, Paul records eyewitnesses in 1 Corinthians 15, which he knew personally, that were claiming that Jesus had resurrected. These include Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, the 12 apostles at one time, another group including apostles beyond the 12, and even 500 people at one time. Paul had personally met Peter, James, and other leaders in the church, so it is highly improbable he was mistaken about their claiming resurrection. Regarding the 500 people that Paul says saw the risen Jesus at one time, Paul suggests to his audience that some of these people were still alive when he was writing and could be consulted, showing that this was not a group that was totally unknown to Paul, but he likely knew people from that group that had personally confirmed these claims to him. The second reason to believe that people close to the facts were claiming resurrection is that, 2, the 4 gospel accounts, which were likely formed by eyewitnesses or those with access to eyewitnesses, independently record resurrection appearances to individuals and groups such as the women at the tomb, the 12 apostles, and other disciples. Skeptics often take the approach of calling into question the gospel narratives, in particular on the basis of their supposed late dating and internal contradictions. I want to warn ahead of time that these are red herrings in this debate. Even if there were internal contradictions between the gospel accounts, they all still agree on the basic story, and they all agree that Jesus rose. In fact, apparent differences in the Gospels show that these are not carefully crafted legends, but true eyewitness accounts, which often do contain apparent, though perhaps not irreconcilable, contradictions. The dating issue is likewise a red herring because even if the Gospel accounts were written down a generation or 2 after the time of Jesus, it is evident that the eyewitness traditions behind the Gospels have been faithfully preserved and have not been radically altered by legends. Here are just a few reasons to believe this. First, the Gospels accurately depict a pre-70 AD Palestine, which was radically changed in that year with the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple, making it difficult for later non-eyewitnesses to get these details right. For example, the Gospels accurately depict the complex relationships and theologies of the various Jewish factions at the time. Jesus is recorded as giving several accurate instructions concerning temple offerings that could not have been carried out after the destruction of the temple. Rome is depicted as friendlier to Christians than the Jews in the Gospels, a situation which changed with Nero's persecution. This change was reflected in later Christian writings such as the Book of Revelation. Personal names in the Gospels have also been shown to accurately represent the known distribution of names in that time and place. Scholar Luke Vandewey performed a statistical analysis on these personal names and concluded that it was 86% likely that one could pick people from first century Palestine and come out with a name distribution like the one we see in the Gospels. For comparison, well-accepted Jewish historian Josephus only came out with a 65% chance of accurately representing the names of his time and place. The Gospels are also distinct from even late first century Christianity in their theological expressions and concerns, something that would be unexpected if a later Christian author was writing the Gospels. For example, the use of the title Son of Man to refer to Jesus, the lack of the use of the third day to refer to the timing of the resurrection, and the lack of concern in the Gospels with high priority issues in the later first century church, such as spiritual gifts, Judaizing, and church organization, all indicate that the gospel traditions are better suited to the early first century. The use of Aramaic and the preservation of Aramaisms, which are detectable Aramaic phrases behind the written Greek, attest to the fact that many traditions were originally spoken in the language of Jesus. Interestingly, when personal names are used in the Gospels, there is often a higher prevalence of these Aramaisms, showing that, as was common in historical biographies of the time, these names likely referred to living persons who shared their testimonies to be recorded in the Gospels. The manner in which witnesses are named in the Gospels also points to the fact that the original audience would have still had access to these witnesses. A good example of this is Simon of Cyrene, who was forced to carry Jesus' cross and who is said in the Gospel of Mark to be the father of Alexander and Rufus. The naming of these sons is entirely unnecessary to the story unless they were known by Mark's audience, which indicates that these traditions came from real people close to the events. Just a few more points against the legend theory is that there are embarrassing details in the Gospels that would have been unlikely for later Christians to invent, such as the cowardice of the disciples, the comparative bravery of the women, the unbelief of Jesus' brothers, and Jesus' own words that seem harsh at times and at others appear to portray him as weak. Finally, there is ample evidence that the earliest Christians highly valued eyewitness testimony and checking their traditions with the apostles, as Paul himself did, such that it is hard to imagine legends could have developed while the controlling influence of the apostles remained present. If we can be sure that the gospel traditions are very early, and that early on in the Christian community, the apostles had a controlling influence over the tradition as a result of being the eyewitnesses to the events, then we can conclude that those closest to the events did claim the kinds of resurrection appearances we see in the Gospels. Having established that there were people close to the facts that claimed Jesus had resurrected, the next question is 3. Did those making these claims believe they were true? The alternative is that the disciples were lying. In support of an affirmative answer to this question, we may consider that Christians close to the facts who claim the resurrection gain nothing on earth for this that would come close to being worth the persecutions and martyrdom they endured. James, the brother of Jesus, Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and Paul are all among those who very likely were martyred as a result of preaching the resurrection. It is also highly likely they knew from the outset that this was a probable outcome of their preaching, having seen how Jesus himself was treated. As has been said, someone may be willing to die for something they believe is true, but few are willing to die for something they know is a lie, much less if they would gain no conceivable benefit from that lie. The earliest Christians also appear to have had a high integrity, as is evident from their writings, as well as the writings of outside their community. The embarrassing details contained in the Gospels also make it unlikely that the apostles were lying, since it's hard to imagine how embarrassing themselves would benefit their alleged attempts to gain power, money, or status. Finally, there are several indications in the earliest Christian writings that they were aiming for truth. For example, on several occasions, the Gospel authors parenthetically explained the meaning of Jesus' words. If they were making up these accounts, it would be more expedient to simply put whatever words they wanted in the mouth of Jesus to increase their authority. Paul, similarly, is careful in his letters to distinguish between commands that Jesus gave and commands that he gives, lest his audience should think that they are on the same level. Finally, there are many subtle indications of truth-telling in the Gospels. One is unexplained allusions. These are instances in which a story or detail is left unexplained, such as the reason for the nickname Sons of Thunder given to 2 of Jesus' disciples, or exactly what it meant that Jesus saw Nathanael under the fig tree. An author carefully crafting a legend would be much more likely to stop and explain such details, but these kinds of loose ends are common in everyday oral testimonies, providing evidence that this is what the Gospels are. So, if those that were close to the facts and who claimed that Jesus had risen from the dead believed their own words, then question 4 is, did they believe this because they experienced something that was external to their mind? The alternative to this is that these claims resulted from something like hallucinations. The problem here is that the appearances of Jesus are well attested to have been experienced by individuals and groups in multisensory ways, pointing to his physicality, but containing the same content over extended periods of time. Jesus broke bread for the disciples, he ate with them on multiple occasions, he walked with some of them and explained things about the scriptures for an extended amount of time. Mary Magdalene likely embraced him, and the disciples specifically examined the body and wounds of Jesus to see whether he was a spirit. Such hallucinatory experiences are unheard of and would themselves be miraculous, as a group of people sharing a dream with the same content would be miraculous. Additionally, most people who experience hallucinations come to know shortly afterward that it was hallucinatory. As many people who claim to see Jesus alive again, it seems unlikely we would have no accounts of some who came to their senses. Ancient peoples, contrary to popular belief, were also skeptical of miracle claims, and the idea of a single man resurrecting to glory before the end of time was a concept that was unheard of prior to Christianity. Because of this, the disciples would have been much more likely to believe that they had seen Jesus' ghost or a vision if it had not been abundantly clear that he was in physical form. The early Christians, in fact, had a defined category for visions and could tell when something was visionary or real, and when they couldn't, they weren't afraid to say so, as Paul himself does. More likely than that, however, since the dying Messiah was an oxymoron to first century Jews, the followers of Jesus would have just packed up and gone home at his crucifixion, as in other cases where someone claimed to be the Messiah and then died, and as the Gospels depict the disciples themselves doing before the resurrection appearances. Finally, hallucinations do not explain the empty tomb, and so even more theories will need to be added to this one to account for all the data, decreasing its simplicity. Finally, question 5 asks, if there were those close to the facts that claimed and believed Jesus had resurrected, and this belief was caused by something external to their minds, was it Jesus himself who caused the belief? The alternative here is that the disciples mistook someone or something else for Jesus. The followers of Jesus, which included his family members, were perfectly capable, however, of correctly identifying him, especially over the extended periods of time they spent with him in the gospel accounts. Finally, once again, ancient people were skeptical of miracle claims, and the Gospels depict the disciples themselves as offering natural explanations, and so it is unlikely that some fleeting glimpse of a figure could have convinced them, much less produce the accounts we have received. The conclusion of answering these 5 questions, then, is that 1. Jesus died on the cross. 2. People who were in a position to know the truth claimed to see Jesus alive after his death. 3. At least some of these people believed what they claimed was true. 4. At least some of them had, as the cause of this belief, an experience of something external to their own mind. And 5. The thing that caused these experiences was Jesus himself. With all of these in place, the conclusion is unavoidable. Jesus rose from the dead. I've spent much time tonight discussing the historical data. Data need explaining. The power of the resurrection hypothesis is that it can explain all of the data in 2 words: Jesus rose. One final point is for the skeptic, which may admit that the resurrection makes the most sense of the historical data, but is still unwilling to commit because of a feeling that miracles are so near impossible that any natural theory should be preferred, no matter how far-fetched it may seem. I would ask that person to consider the many well-documented miracles that have occurred through prayer in Jesus' name. These cases create a background for viewing the resurrection in which miracles, while still extraordinary, are not considered to be so extraordinary that they are deemed impossible from the outset without giving the evidence a fair hearing. And if Jesus did resurrect from the dead, we shouldn't find it surprising at all that miracles are done in his name even today. That's what I got. And so since I got a little bit more time, I'll just say I want to thank my opponent and the moderator for putting this on, because they set everything up and I pretty much just waltzed into this debate. So thank you guys. Well, that's the end.
Thank you. Very good. All right, let me set up the time again. Of course. All right. What is that? Timer? 20-minute timer, right? All right. Okay. Sorry about that. Shouldn't have happened. Okay, we are now moving into the negative opening statement. You have 15 minutes, and your time begins once you start speaking, Cortez. You there?
Alright, cool. Everybody can hear me. Everything's well. Alright. Well, first I'm just gonna say I am kind of sick right now, so hopefully I don't get interrupted when I'm coughing. So that's probably gonna be the worst part of it. But other than that, if I don't get interrupted by my cough, then I should be fine. But yeah, for this debate, I want to begin by thanking everyone for being here today, whether you were invited or just happened to join us in the room. I also want to thank my opponent for showing up and participating, and the host for organizing and moderating this discussion, making it possible. Most of you probably know me, but for those who don't, my name is Cortez. I usually host debates and discussions here on big screen about the existence of God. My room's usually titled things like There is no evidence for God or God isn't real. And I host about 4 to 5 times a week, usually around 8 p.m. Central Time. And as you can tell, I am an atheist. So today I will argue that the resurrection is an unnecessary assumption and that natural explanations consistent with what we know about history and human behavior make a literal resurrection extremely unlikely. So Christianity is built around one central claim, that Jesus rose from the dead. Now the question before us is not whether the story has meaning or whether it inspires people or even whether it has shaped culture, because clearly it has done a lot of these things. The real question is whether a literal resurrection is the best explanation for the historical evidence we have. Well, historians, when studying events from the past, use reasoning similar to what we use in science and daily life. They prefer natural explanations because these can be observed, tested, and confirmed. Supernatural explanations, by contrast, introduce causes that cannot be independently confirmed. If a natural explanation fully explains the evidence, then a miracle is not required. Okay. To be clear, I am not disputing everything about Jesus. For this debate, I will concede points widely accepted by scholars. Jesus of Nazareth existed. He was an apocalyptic preacher in first century Judea, a time and place filled with similar figures announcing God's kingdom. Roman authorities crucified him, a punishment that almost always led to death. The central issue is not whether Jesus lived or died. It is what happened after his death and whether a miracle is needed to explain it. Human psychology provides strong natural explanations, such as bereavement visions, experiences in which grieving people see, hear, or sense a deceased loved one are common. Studies suggest 30 to 60% of grieving individuals report such experiences, and they are often vivid and convincing. These findings appear in clinical grief research and peer-reviewed literature, such as the Journal of Affective Disorders. It is reasonable that a grief-induced experience led Peter to sincerely believe Jesus appeared to him. Once that belief formed, social influence, expectation, and shared hope could have spread the belief to others, including James, brother of Jesus. Paul's later conversion also follows recognized psychological patterns. He describes visionary encounters and explains that he understood Jesus primarily through revelations rather than personal interaction with the historical figure. Visionary religious experiences are widely documented across cultures and do not require a supernatural event to explain them. All right. The burial of Jesus, often treated as certain, is much less clear than people assume. Historical records do not confirm where or how Jesus' body was buried. The tomb story appears only in later Christian writings, and no independent Roman or Jewish sources confirm it. Roman crucifixion victims were often left exposed or placed in common graves, a practice documented by historians studying Roman execution methods. Because of this uncertainty, we cannot know where the body was placed, whether it was buried at all, or who even handled it. Without independent confirmation of a tomb, claims about an empty tomb lose much of their evidential strength. In the decades after Jesus' death, stories about him spread by word of mouth, oral transmission, naturally changes over time. Cognitive psychology shows that memory is reconstructive and not photographic, meaning we rebuild memories each time we recall them. Research by memory expert Elizabeth demonstrates how recollections can shift through repetition, suggestion, and expectation. Research on oral traditions confirm that stories evolve as they pass through communities. They are shaped by expectation, cultural meaning, and social pressures. Over time, narratives naturally develop theological or symbolic elements. In this context, it is not surprising that the empty tomb, group appearances, and martyr traditions appear to develop over time, reflecting the shaping of memory and culture rather than direct first-hand documentation. The growth of Christianity also does not prove that a miracle occurred. History is full of rapidly spreading religious and social movements. Islam, for example, spread across vast regions within a century of the death of Muhammad, becoming a major world religion through social, political, and cultural forces rather than a single verifiable miracle event. Christianity's eventual acceptance within the Roman Empire demonstrates the power of belief organization and social momentum, but is not evidence of a supernatural event. When defenders of the resurrection appeal to eyewitness testimony, the historical record provides little support, such as Paul, the earliest Christian writer, was not a follower of Jesus during his lifetime. He describes his encounter as visionary rather than physical. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul mentions more than 500 people who saw Jesus, but he names none of them, offers no testimony, and provides no independent verification. This reflects tradition rather than documented eyewitness examination. No contemporary Roman or Jewish sources confirm the resurrection. Later accounts of miracles are also not independently recorded. The evidence we do have comes through layers of oral tradition and interpretation, but not direct documentation. The psychological processes already described, such as bereavement experiences, visionary encounters, and memory reconstruction and social reinforcement, are well documented in clinical psychology and grief studies. Peer-reviewed research consistently reports post-bereavement sensory experiences, and a significant portion of grieving individuals, as I already mentioned before, 30 to 60% supporting the natural explanations already discussed. These findings are widely recognized in grief psychology literature and provide empirical support for how sincere resurrection beliefs could arise without requiring a single supernatural cause, such as the resurrection. To argue that the resurrection is most likely explanation, my opponent must do more than appeal to belief or tradition. He must show why natural explanations fail, provide reliable primary sources with independent support, demonstrate internal consistency, account for bias and perspective, engage with peer-reviewed research and historical consensus. If these standards are not met, natural explanations remain far more plausible because they align with what we consistently observe in the world. According to Occam's razor, the explanation with the fewest unsupported assumption is preferred. A resurrection introduces a supernatural cause for which we have no independently verified examples, no confirmed historical parallels, no observable mechanism. In contrast, we have extensive evidence for grief experiences, visionary encounters and memory distortion, social influence, and the development of religious traditions. The question is not whether a resurrection is possible, it is whether it is necessary to explain the evidence. When natural processes fully account for what we observe, appealing to supernatural does not strengthen the explanation. It adds an assumption the evidence does not require. The resurrection may inspire faith, shape culture, may change lives, but the inspiration is not the same as evidence. Natural explanations, as I mentioned, grief visions, memory, social influence, fully explain the rise of the resurrection belief. They match what we know about human psychology, history, and society. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. That evidence does not exist at all, and when what is known and natural fully explains the story, there is no need to reach for the supernatural claims, such as the resurrection. I think that's all I have. Yeah, that is all I have. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm done.
Sorry, I had myself on mute. All right, let me stop the time, and then we're going to move into rebuttals. And we're going to have 2 rebuttals. Each speaker will have 10 minutes per rebuttal, and the purpose of rebuttals is to respond directly to arguments already presented. Give me a second here to set the time. All right. Almost there. And then your time will start when you start speaking for the affirmative. Okay?
All right. Good job, Cortez. All right. So let me try to address some of the things that he mentioned. So he said that we should prefer natural explanations. I agree with this. In general, before looking at the evidence, we should prefer natural explanations. Or, another thing, you could just put it, we should prefer more likely explanations, right? Like, we don't see someone rising from the dead every day. We see people lying every day, let's say. So shouldn't we prefer, something that is a more likely explanation? But I think that misses the fact that we still need to look at the evidence. Like, we may have some prior probabilities in our mind for how likely an event might be, and it might be really low when we first think about it. But when we actually look at the evidence, then we have to factor that in. And so I agree, that we should prefer natural explanations at the beginning. But once you look at the evidence, if it tilts in favor of a non-natural explanation, then we should prefer that. So he also said, if a non-natural or if a natural explanation fully explains the evidence. And with that, I would say, I don't think that the natural explanations do explain the evidence. Now, again, you can come up with so many natural explanations. Like, let me rephrase. You can explain the evidence that we have with natural explanations, but you have to continue to add natural explanations to get the kind of, as I mentioned, explanatory scope, explanatory power that we have with the simple explanation that Jesus rose from the dead. So, just to name a few, I think it sounded like Cortez had a mix of bereavement hallucinations and legend building in his theory of the resurrection. And so, does instrumental or hallucinations, does that deal with the evidence of the reliable accounts of the empty tomb, which I'll try to get into because I know he mentioned that? Does it deal with the evidence for group appearances, which Paul, who did name eyewitnesses, and he named eyewitnesses that were in groups when they saw the risen Jesus? Does it account for the kinds of experiences we see, and which I argued go very early and would have been under the controlling influence of the apostles? So would have come from the apostles in the Gospels, experiences that are multisensory, that are physical in nature, that are over extended periods of time. Do they account for things like that? So where was I? So he asked, is a miracle needed to explain the resurrection? Well, I would say, no, it's not needed to explain. But the debate tonight is not, is a miracle absolutely necessary to explain what happened in the first century? The debate is it more probable than not that Jesus rose from the dead? And I think when we look at the evidence and we start building this case, we'll see that it is. And so I mentioned some things about hallucinations. I mentioned plenty about the legend hypothesis in my opening statement, so maybe I'll let him respond to those things. Let me move on so I don't run out of time here. So he mentioned Paul's experience. Now, I didn't bring up Paul in my opening statement because I do think his experience is a little bit different than the other apostles. But I would mention that it would be much more difficult to explain the appearance to Paul on something like a bereavement hallucination. And I would also add that for James, the brother of Jesus, as well as Jesus' other brothers who appeared to have come to believe James on the basis of an appearance to him. Because James was not a believer before he experienced an appearance of Jesus to him. All right, so let me get into the burial of Jesus, because he seemed to think that was a pretty strong point. So let me give you a couple reasons to believe in the empty tomb, and I'll be interested to see how he would address these. So number one, there's multiple attestation in the gospel accounts, and those are independent accounts. At one point, it seemed like he referenced the gospel accounts as, late or something like that, but I think I argued in my opening statement pretty well that they're early. They're early enough to be in the time of the apostles, and they likely go back to them. But I assume he won't accept that. And so I think there are some other strong arguments for the empty tomb. Let me give a few. So once again, Paul, who is very close to the eyewitnesses, says that Jesus was buried and raised, indicating an empty tomb. Other arguments are that the discovery of the empty tomb by women is highly probable due to the fact that their inclusion as the first witnesses would have been embarrassing to the early disciples. So you wouldn't make up a story about women discovering the empty tomb, because they were thought of so lowly in first century in a first century context. Their witness didn't mean much, and they were thought to be even in the Gospels themselves. When the disciples hear that they have discovered an empty tomb, they think it's idle talk coming from the women, and that is pretty consistent with what we see first century sources, how they speak about women. Some other things are that the earliest Jewish argument against the resurrection, recorded in Matthew 28, presupposes the empty tomb. So in Matthew 28, Matthew says that the Jews were spreading a rumor that the disciples had come and stolen the body. And the way they were able to do this is that the guards of the tomb had fallen asleep. And so Matthew is responding to a Jewish argument that was being made against Christians. And this argument isn't, hey, there was never any tomb. Jesus was thrown in a pit somewhere. The argument was that the guards had fallen asleep and the disciples had stolen the body. And that's how they were able to have an empty tomb. So even the opponents of Christianity assumed the empty tomb in their argumentation against Christians. Another one is Joseph of Arimathea, who's recorded in the Gospels as a member of the Sanhedrin and who would place Jesus in the tomb, in his own tomb. So this is very unlikely to have been invented, since inventing someone with a name, hometown, and high-profile occupation, being a member of the Sanhedrin, would make little sense if one were trying to pass off a lie. It would also be embarrassing that the disciples needed a member of the group that crucified Jesus to bury him, since they were hiding away in fear. So all of these things are things that you would not invent if you were just going to make up a story. And so they add credibility to the early empty tomb accounts. I'll run through a few more of these pretty quickly. So the cultural details regarding the need to prepare a crucified body quickly before sundown, as well as the kind of tomb being suited to a rich person like Joseph of Arimathea, are plausible for that time and place. The story is simple and lacks later legendary development, such as we find in the 2nd century Gospel of Peter, in which Jesus exits the tomb with his head raised past the clouds with a talking cross following behind him. The expression, the first day of the week, instead of on the third day, the Gospels use the phrase, the first day of the week, proves that the empty tomb account is extremely old, because on the third day, quickly, even by Paul's writings, becomes the standard formula for expressing the day that Jesus rose from the dead. The pre-Markan Passion narrative, which contains the empty tomb, is likely much older than Mark. It would have been difficult for the disciples to proclaim the resurrection in Jerusalem had the tomb not been empty, because that people would have just refuted them and been like, hey, the tomb's empty. Although I guess my opponent doesn't think that there was a tomb at all, potentially. And then Matthew claims that the story that the guards fell asleep. Okay, I covered that one. So those are just a few reasons to believe in the empty tomb. I think my opponent also mentioned that he thinks that the story would be that Jesus was more than likely unburied. So I want to address that. So number one, there was a Jewish custom of burying hanged men. That comes from Deuteronomy 21. And so this is in the Jewish scriptures and would have been something that they followed, to bury men who were hanged. And so they would have followed through with that. Another thing is, yeah, sure. Another thing is that there is archaeological evidence of a first century entombed crucified victim who was Jewish. And so we literally have the heel bone of a crucified victim who is Jewish in a tomb. And so this shows that it isn't, it wasn't against practice to put such a person in a tomb, So I think that covers that. Let me see if I got anything else here I can hit really quick. He mentioned, he kind of mentioned that memories might be bad, but memories are the basis of everything we know, and and do really. Of course, memories can be bad in certain situations, but they're remarkably accurate depending on the circumstances.
Okay, finish up.
Yep. Is that it? Or
That was it.
okay,
Yeah,
awesome.
that's all, yeah.
Dang, that was a short minute.
Right. I don't know why this 20-minute timer does not want to play with me. Alright. We're going to go down to 10. Alright. Then we're going to bring this back up. Okay. We are now going to do the negative rebuttal. You have 10 minutes to speak, and it will start once you start speaking, Cortez.
Okay, cool. I can speak. All right. Yeah, there's a few things he said. My opponent did say a few things and tried responding to my arguments. But I think the issue here is I wish you could have possibly expanded more on demonstration, or especially when it came up to like citing sources, because I really don't know. It seems like you repeated your claims, but you didn't really provide any like actual historical evidence for the claims you're essentially making, other than highlighting quotes from the Gospels and then trying to justify your claims through the thing that is not even reliable. I mean, if we're gonna have to go down that pathway of whether the Gospels are reliable or not, if you're going to use the Gospels as historical um, or as an independent verification or records of the resurrection or people being eyewitnesses or the tomb. So, I mean, again, I wish you would expand it on that. I'm going to try to respond to your points as honestly as I possibly can, because again, if I do accidentally strawman you, I apologize. I tried writing you what you said quote by quote, but sadly I couldn't do it quote by quote, so I only have a few things of what you said. But I'll attempt to go with your first claim, or the first statement you were talking about, is that you can explain things natural, but the simple explanation is that Jesus rose from the dead. I think the problem here is that whenever they're like you're saying we can provide natural explanations, but then we're gonna have to provide natural explanations for everything else. I don't see the issue with that. So you're saying might as well just go with the simple explanation that Jesus resurrected. That's almost like me saying, hey, I don't know the complexity behind how the expansion of the universe. Therefore, I'm going to add an explanation that's simple and just doesn't actually accurately explain what happened. There are things that may be complex and pretty hard to naturally grasp, but adding a supernatural as a simple explanation is just really laziness. I mean, I could do that. I mean, I could be like, okay, I don't know the expansion of how the universe works, therefore I'm just going to put it as simple as, um, the way it works is that God created each thing step by step, instead of just accepting a natural explanation that may be complex and hard to understand. So yeah, I guess my point on that is that just because something is complex and that you have to add, I mean, it's not really that much complex, but adding a natural, it's pretty much simple to understand naturally as well. But trying to simplify it by adding something supernatural to get rainbows and wishes out of it isn't going to help your situation out. Um, and talking about the empty tomb and group appearances, it seems like it kind of got circular. You cited the Gospels as such as you talked about how you started describe you get into like a description of what happened. There's you mentioned someone who carried the cross, and about Jesus getting put into a tomb. Now, one thing I did want to say is I didn't say that there's not a potential that Jesus couldn't have been put into a tomb. I never said that. I just never said there's no historical evidence to say that that is actual. That's what I'm trying to say. There's a difference between saying Jesus could have potentially been in a tomb versus Jesus is actually in a tomb. So again, I am saying there is. I'm fine with saying that there's potential behind him getting put in a tomb, but I don't necessarily think it was actual. That's the historical evidence we're looking for here. And you talk about group appearances on how it's highly implausible that they just invented a story and died for their beliefs. I'm not sure if you said that they died for their beliefs as an argument, but the thing is again, you're citing gospels that were written decades later. I wish you would expand it on the historical evidence as those being contemporary, because they're definitely not contemporary. They're written like 35 to 70 years after the events were recorded. These are not contemporary sources. And to go back to what you talked about, memory, memory is what we rely on. We don't essentially just rely on memory. We're relying on contemporary sources. We're relying on more than just memories. I mean, over time, if you just, I want you to have a moment. Imagine you experience something, right? And then like 30 to 70 years later, you try to remember it. Do you think your memory is going to be completely accurate? Because again, as I mentioned, you could look at the Journal of Affective Disorders, as I already quoted. You can go look at that sources, and there's a lot of sources being provided on how there are literal memory distortion, where over time your memories, as you keep retelling these things, your memories, it's going to change over time. You're not going to have these actual accurate memories as you had originally. So that's why contemporary sources are going to be reliable in the sense, because they report in the date that it happened, or a few days or years or months after the event. So that's why we're going to refer to contemporary sources rather than gospels that were written 35 to 70 years after the events. So I guess my question to you, or my challenge to you would be is, provide historical evidence that the Gospels are actually contemporary, if you're going to state that. Um, and to say that the group appearances did happen, I would love to see the historical evidence for that. Which Roman or Jewish sources records any of that? Because none of them do. You mentioned a story about how, I don't know who it was, Peter, I don't know who it was, that argued with I don't know who it was. They argued with the soldiers, I think, about something about, um, they were the body was stolen, right? They were arguing against that. Again, that's reported in the Gospels. There's no Jewish or Roman sources that actually confirm what you're saying. I mean, you're referring to theological points rather than firsthand documentation, as I've already mentioned in my opening statement. So again, provide historical evidence for that. And you also mentioned woman who supposedly seen um, Jesus after he had risen, or supposedly the empty tomb. Well, again, provide historical evidence for that, because you keep on referencing the quotes in the Bible, you keep on going to the Gospels, but again, these Gospels are written decades later. And I even have an argument against the idea that these were actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first point is that these people were illiterate. They spoke, their primary language was Aramaic. They weren't very influenced in Greek. And first of all, the Gospels were also written in Greek, and it clearly does not seem like it was written by illiterate people and fishermen. So, again, you're going to have to provide some historical evidence that the Gospels were actually contemporary, and in order for me to accept it as an independent verification for the resurrection or any claims about an empty tomb or group appearances, because martyr traditions appear over time. Like the apostles dying for their faith is only appealed in theology. It's not firsthand documentation, although there was martyrs, there was people getting killed for their beliefs. But guess what? People die for anything. There's a lot, we see that throughout religions and cultures where people die for political and religious beliefs over time. Um, Let me just make sure there's nothing else, because I've tried mentioning as much as I can. Uh, I'm trying to represent as much as you said as accurate as possible. Um, oh yeah, I think you mentioned about the bereavement experiences that I mentioned. Well, the thing is that I have no reason to believe that there was actually anything external from the person's perception other than the bereavement hallucination, because again, these bereavement hallucinations are very well realistic. Again, I myself have experienced one with the loss of an animal. And guess what? It was real, and I was convinced for years that I actually did see my animal, even though that was not the case. By the way, it was my cat. But no, it was the case that it wasn't true, or true. And again, the percentage of 30 to 60% of people who actually have these bereavement experiences after the death of a loved one, and it doesn't even have to necessarily be a loved one. I mean, as I was looking through the Journal of Affective Disorders from the School of Medicine, I even saw that there was literally people who supposedly they even if you don't actually are like, even if you're not so close to this person, or actually like full on like, loving this person or close to them, you can still experience it, although the percentage is reduced. But to say that there's any supernatural explanations to these, or that there was an external appearance that Jesus actually bodily shown himself. Again, I would love
You've
to
got
see
a
at least
minute.
contemporary sources. All right, cool. But as much as I can say, I tried grasping over as much as you can say. I mean, again, I'm hoping my opponent will be able to expand on what he said so I can expand myself, because I'm repeating a lot of the things I'm saying because I didn't see too much expansion on it. So yeah, my two challenges to my opponent is what is what would be the historical evidence that the Gospels are contemporary sources to the events that's recorded that supposedly claims, and what is and then what other evidence would you suggest to say that these people, that it wasn't, that the natural explanations are insufficient, and that these aren't like, that there was an actual a bodily external appearance, other than their appearance, Jesus was actually there. You know what I mean? I would love to see what evidence you have for that, or what argument or justification you have for that. But as much as I can say, the timer is out, so
Yep, you're
that's
out.
all I can say. Oh no, I'm in the audience. My bad.
Okay, we'll set it down to 10 minutes again. We're going to do the second round of rebuttals now. And we're going back to the affirmative. Hold on a second. Let me just... All right. Okay, you can talk when you start talking. I will start the clock.
All right. I'm going to try and address things a little bit quicker. First time doing a debate, so... all right. It seems like there's a question in my opponent's mind of, can the Gospels be used as historical documents? Because it seems like all of the longest section of my opening statement was reasons why the traditions behind the Gospels go early. But it seems like everything that I've brought up from the Gospels, it seems like he just says, those are from the Gospels, but the Gospels are historical documents before they're scripture. We can look at this, and I have looked at this tonight from the perspective that this isn't scripture. I'm just looking at purely as if they're historical documents. And so in that regard, one example is that the Gospels are historical evidence for the empty tomb. It seemed like, all the things that I just said, he said, well, you just found that in the Gospels. Well, I'm looking critically at the Gospels, right? I'm looking at things that historians use to evaluate historical documents. So we don't just take any historical document and say, oh, somebody wrote this down, so it happened. No, we look at it and we apply certain criteria. Is there multiple attestation? Does it go early? And these did go very early, the empty tomb accounts. We look at things like embarrassing details, women at the tomb, Joseph of Arimathea. I don't have to repeat it because I would like your response at some point to those type of things. But those are things that are found in the Gospels, but they're not treating the Gospels from the outset as if they're an authoritative source. They're looking critically at them and seeing what kind of historical facts we can glean from them with a surety. And so my opponent said that Gospels date within 35 to 70 years. And he seemed to be under the impression that, the disciples, they experienced the appearances of Jesus, and then they went 30 to 70 years. And then they said, you know what? That was a pretty interesting event. Let me write that down and see what I can remember about it. But that isn't how it happened. First of all, I gave a slew of evidence that the traditions behind the Gospels, whether they were written, the day after Jesus died, or whether they were written in 90 AD, the traditions behind the Gospels fit very well with an early first century context and not with a later one. And so I'd be interested for him to address some of my points on that. And if I have some time for the rest of this debate, I'll go back into them. So he said, we can't rely on memory again because we have we have like sources and stuff to look at. But we do have to rely on our memory, because if we couldn't rely on our memory, we'd read a contemporary source and then we'd turn around and forget it, right? And memory is reliable for major events, especially in this context if they are immediately told which again, I've argued that they go back very early. They're immediately told. They become fixed within a community, and they're told as oral stories, which the Gospels did, and become fixed. And oral communities have these type of controls. Number one, the apostles were still around. Number two, oral communities have these controls where if somebody, makes a mistake or something, they're corrected. Okay, moving on from that. So yeah, he mentioned 75 years later, will I remember something? Again, they didn't write these things down 75 years later. They began telling them immediately, and those traditions were encoded and then may have been later written down, although I would argue they very well could have been written down within the lifetime of the apostles. And I believe they were written down by the traditional authors. So were there Roman or Jewish sources that mention the resurrection? Well, there are Roman and Jewish sources that mention that people believed in the resurrection. But of course, if they said that Jesus rose from the dead, well, they'd be Christian, and then he'd discount them potentially because they were Christian. Paul was a Roman, and maybe he misspoke and meant to say Greek, but Paul was a Roman, as well as a Jew, obviously. So anyway, let me move on from that. There was another big one I wanted to hit. So martyrs. He said that martyrdom accounts are really only theology and not history. So I want to let me just look at the death of James, the brother of Jesus. So James, the brother of Jesus, his death is told about by Josephus, who lived contemporary with that time. So let me give you a quotation from Josephus writing about the death of the brother James. He says, Ananus assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. And so the important thing about this is Josephus is the Jewish historian. He was in with the aristocracy of the first century Jews, like the high priest. He writes elsewhere in his histories that he personally knew Ananus, who put James, the brother of Jesus, to death. And so he personally knew this guy. He personally worked with him during the Jewish wars. And so that's massive. I mean, that's about as close as you get in ancient sources like this. Another interesting thing is that Ananus, who put James to death, his father-in-law, I believe, put Jesus to death. So he was the high priest that put Jesus to death. And so Josephus is in with these groups. And by the way, Josephus also writes about the death of Jesus and the fact that his followers claimed resurrection. And so these are historical accounts that are very, very close to the facts of what happened. And so the death of the apostles, the martyrdom, is not just, theology. Just persecution in general. Persecution is immediately very plausible for a group whose founder was executed, right? But then Paul often mentions in his letters to his audience, or Paul appeals in his letters to his audience firsthand knowledge of his persecutions. Paul couldn't do that unless his audience had seen him persecuted. And it's hard to imagine these persecutions would not have extended to the rest of the apostles whose ministries Paul describes as being much like his own. Also, non-Christians like Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and Suetonius, all 2nd century, describe persecutions of Christians. And I'm prepared to, I went into James, the brother of Jesus, because I think that one's very close. But, I could defend Peter, Paul, James, the son of Zebedee. So these are not just theology. These are very, very certain to have been martyred in history. Let's see. So he mentions, kind of going back to the Gospels thing, he mentioned Matthew's report on the empty tomb is in the Gospels, therefore it's unreliable. But the argument there is looking critically at the text. It's saying, okay, Matthew's responding to an argument that the Jews are making in his time. What argument are the Jews making that he feels the need to respond to? They're making the argument that the disciples stole the body from the tomb. That presupposes a burial in a tomb that was known. And so, again, this is looking critically at the documents we have, not just assuming that they're scripture and so taking their word for it. Let's see. Cortez was convinced for years that his animals was alive, but I mean, it seems like he did find out, right, uh, that wasn't the case, which is something that I mentioned for bereavement hallucinations, that oftentimes they don't carry the kind of influence that would make someone actually think that their dead loved one had come back to life, or if they did, they would quickly find out once the hallucination was over that had not actually happened, that it was a hallucination. And again, the first century people, they had categories for this, right? They knew about bereavement hallucinations. If nothing else, they knew about ghosts. And that's another thing, is that, again, as I said in my opening statement, people in the first century, Jews who had experienced bereavement hallucinations like that, would have been much more likely to conclude that their Messiah had been spiritually vindicated.
1 minute.
He had appeared to him in a vision or something like that. Not that a single man had resurrected to glory before the end of time, which was unheard of. So something has to account for that unique belief among Christians. And again, it doesn't explain the empty tomb, which I've mentioned multiple times now why that's reliable. It doesn't explain the evidence for the group appearances. And again, Paul gives group appearances of people that he personally talked to. And again, I'll have to go into it more if I have more time, but the Gospels record the content of these group experiences because these traditions go back early, and they go back so early that they are within the time of the apostles that would have had a controlling influence over these reports. Let's see. I don't think I have time for anything else. 7 seconds.
You done?
Yeah.
You done? All right. Okay. We're going to now do into the final rebuttal for the negative argument. And we'll do 10 minutes. I'm going to get this right one time. And then as soon as you start speaking, we will start the time. Give me a second here to pull this up. Okay. When you're ready, Cortez.
Okay, cool. Maybe I should have been more specific because I think there was a bit of confusion on my arguments or rebuttals towards what he attempted to rebuttal. So maybe I'm going to be more specific this time. So whenever you mention that the Gospels are historical, like they're historical evidence for the claims such as like empty tomb and eyewitnesses and the resurrection, you said that historians, when they evaluate about the past, they go to these kind of sources. But the problem here is that historians, whenever they're trying to evaluate about what happened in the past and all that stuff, they're looking at contemporary sources. My point is that these gospels are not contemporary. There's a difference. Okay, so whenever I mean, I would love for you to list one historian that has actually looked into the New Testament and used the Gospels to help explain, or best explain, any of the supernatural claims. Or not even supernatural, just such as there's being supposedly eyewitnesses, or the idea that there was a tomb that was empty that was supposedly that Jesus' body was put in. I mean, I would love for you to list one historian because these sources that you're using or relying upon to get your information aren't contemporary and therefore wouldn't be a source or anything that would be that would historically independently verify the claims such as empty tomb and the things I just mentioned. Um, and it seemed like you went back to you would love for me to respond to the empty tomb, but the thing is that there is no historical evidence for an empty tomb, and you keep pointing to the Gospels. Again, I'm just gonna have to repeat what I said already, but there is these sources that you're referring to aren't contemporary. So I mean, I'm just gonna leave it at that for now because there's nothing else to add on to that specifically. But then you also pointed out that uh, I guess the confusion here was that whenever I said that supposedly martyr tradition or martyr is theological rather than first-hand documentation. One thing I do agree is that there was martyr because in the sense that there were people that were executed during the first century on a cross. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to refute that. What I'm trying to refute specifically, or not necessarily trying to refute, but to just to show you that you lack evidence when it comes up to the story that you're specifically describing. Don't get me wrong, there was martyr, there was Christians who were or that were pretty much executed. But what I'm specifically describing is the way the story is described in the Gospels, such as the idea that there was a group appearances and then they died for their faith. That is only reported in the Gospels, and the Gospels are not contemporary. So for you to use that as evidence is not valid because the Gospels themselves are not contemporary. These are reports much later and decades later rather than first-hand documentation. So you can't use the Gospels as independent verification because then you're only begging the question by using something that just presupposes everything you're making right now, all the claims that you're making essentially. So when I said that there was the martyr tradition thing or whatever was a theological thing, I'm referring to the way it played out, like the apostles and group appearances died for their faith. I think that part right there is a theological, it's something that's theological, and there is no Jewish sources that are there's no independent Jewish sources besides the Bible that attempt to verify or justify that claim that these apostles died for their faith and actually claim as a group to experience or seen Jesus risen from the dead. So again, please refer to any contemporary sources and don't refer to sources that were written decades later. Maybe that will be helpful for the debate. Um, and then you also mentioned about my cat or whatever analogy. Yeah, so yeah, I did realize that it was the case that it was the bewilderment experience or hallucination, and the reason why is not necessarily because I was just like, oh, you know what, is because it just wasn't too realistic enough or anything like that. No, it's because guess what? I have actually learned over time that hey, this isn't true. There's simple psychology that doesn't require insane studying whatsoever. I didn't even know it was a bewilderment hallucination at all. I just knew it was an experiment that is normal and is common for people that lose such a loved one that they could potentially sense or have visions of that person or animal, whatever it is. So that's specifically what I tried mentioning there. Um, I think another point was again, the stolen body about the presupposition. I would love to see the justification for that presupposition about because you mentioned the um I'm not again my memory I have the memory of a goldfish at the moment, but I'm pretty sure you talked about again the body that was supposed the argument against the body that was stolen, but it was presupposed as you mentioned. Great. Now what's the justification other than listing gospels decades after the events? I think another thing was that these people, you talked about how you'd love for me to respond to the two ladies, or I think it was Mary specifically that you mentioned. I don't know who it was specifically, but you mentioned about ladies who apparently saw and or discovered an empty tomb or supposedly saw Jesus after the resurrection, and it would be absolutely um, it's just terrible to say that okay, these two ladies were just lied about it and then it was just it wouldn't align with what the apostles described. But again, these ladies that you're describing in the gospels and stuff, you're referring to the gospels that were written decades later by Greek storytelling people, but you're not giving a justification for the gospels being written in the early first century. And again, the oral traditions and all that stuff being spread, what it's not this wasn't even like um there was rumors being spread. It was being spread by people who weren't even there to experience the events. That's how beliefs spread. That's how rumors spread. That's how religions could form over time through simple oral traditions and resulting in stories being written, such as people that spoke Greek were able to write the Gospels. So again, give a justification for the Gospels. Um, Being written contemporarily to the events described in the Gospels. Uh, if you cannot do that, then what you are leaning upon is basically presuppositions that have no justification for it. So therefore, I have no reason to accept any of the things that you're presenting as historical evidence. Um, I don't know if there's anything else that I'm missing that you pointed out that I have not responded to because again, you did kind of say it a little quick, that which is on me. I mean, I'm not able to. There's a lot of things that were said. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to keep up as much as I can. But there's nothing else that I could think of possibly of what you mentioned that I could respond to. But what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to leave it at that, and I'm going to let the host decide what's next.
Okay, perfect. We're going to move into the 10-minute moderated open discussion. And this is going to be a segment that is going to be about the speakers may interact directly, but one speaker at a time, no talking over each other. If interruption does become excessive, I will intervene, and we'll go from there at a 10-minute timer here. Right. Come on. There we go. Okay. You guys are more than willing to engage.
All right, cool. I mean, I guess I could start it off.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to start with the Gospels being contemporary? I mean, do you suggest that these Gospels are actually contemporary?
Yeah, that would be a great place to start. And yes, I mean, I would like to ask you about a couple of things regarding just some of the evidences that I mentioned. So, um, a big one, I think, I mean, this is a cumulative case, right? But I'd like to see what you think about this. So, I mentioned how there's an absence of issues in the Gospels that even the later first century church was facing, right? Like Judaizing, which was basically Jews trying to make Gentiles keep the law, spiritual gifts like speaking in tongues, healing, stuff like that, and church organization, how the church should actually be run. So we don't really find that being talked about in the Gospels, right? But that stuff was a high priority even in Paul's time. We see Paul writing about those type of things in his letters in the 50s. And so my question to you is, how do you explain why a later writer who had his own audience that were likely facing these or other issues would not put those in the Gospels?
Well, again, I mean, this was being spread through oral tradition, so or I mean, through oral transmission. So, I mean, I'm sure, I mean, it was getting spread everywhere. I mean, the religion was already expanded rapidly, the stories behind it. And I mean, I don't know how your question, though, necessarily is engaging with the evidence that Jesus resurrected. I mean, I don't know how I mean, you're describing a tradition.
Well, you asked me
And,
to, you asked me to
oh,
give
okay.
evidence for why the Gospels are contemporary, which obviously isn't
Yeah,
directly, dealing with the resurrection, but
okay.
that is what I'm trying to lead the conversation in.
Oh, okay, okay. So you mentioned Paul specifically mentioning the things that were happening in conflict between the church and about how they had to keep like like are you talking about Paul whenever he's telling them what they should and shouldn't do in the churches and telling them what they're doing is wrong? Like, are
No,
you talking
sorry.
about the epistles?
Maybe I can move on to a simpler thing, unless you want me to. Yeah, I'm talking about evidence that the traditions behind the Gospels go back early, and they are contemporary. Evidence that
Yeah, well,
that is true.
I'm willing to say that the traditions are contemporary, but I'm talking about specifically like the story of Jesus and the empty tomb and stuff like that, and
Well,
the
that is
Gospels
the
are
tradition. When,
contemporary.
when I say the traditions behind the Gospels,
Okay.
I mean
Yeah.
the Gospels were written down at a certain point, right? But the traditions behind the Gospels, that what was put into the Gospels when they were written down. These things, it wasn't as if whoever sat down to write the Gospel of Mark put pen to paper and just invented all these things, unless you think that is the case. He had traditions from the church that he was pulling off of, and those traditions are much better suited to the early first century for things like I mentioned, the fact that it doesn't mention things even that were pertinent to a later first century church. The naming of eyewitnesses like Simon of Cyrene, that Mark expected to be known to his audience, right? The even the terminology used, whether it's Son of Man, which doesn't appear in in Christian writings immediately after the Gospels. That term is pretty unique to Jesus. Like that is Jesus' way of describing himself in the Gospels. Things like that. I mean, we could also. I
Okay,
mean,
I
and
get your
like,
point now. No, yeah,
yeah,
please,
yeah. And maybe a big one
So,
is how would you respond to my name statistics argument in the Gospels? So the fact that the personal names that we find in the Gospels, and maybe I can explain that argument a little bit more. The personal names that we find in the Gospels, we can look at other contemporary sources from first century Judea, and we can make a database of names and see which ones are most popular. And these type of statistics are very specific. Like if you change even, a decade or two, you're going to have different name distributions as, we just know in our regular life. Like the most popular name this year isn't going to be the most popular name next year. But the Gospels get that extremely accurately, even more accurately than Josephus, a Jewish historian who everyone pretty much agrees is contemporary with most of the things he's talking about and even witnessed some of the things he's talking about. How would you explain that on the idea that the Gospels are not contemporary?
yeah, well, I mean, I'm going to respond to the first part you just mentioned about the Gospels being written from early first century traditions, except there is literally no surviving Roman or Jewish sources that are contemporary that actually justify any of the things, any of the traditions that you're even saying.
What do you
So
mean by
that's the
that?
issue here. Right, these are Christian theological beliefs that you are talking about, such as the traditions from Christianity in the early first century about people supposedly believing in a tomb,
Right.
about an empty tomb and the resurrection. Yeah, you're mentioning these traditions, but yet not a single Roman or Jewish any records or sources actually justify any of those claims. Is the problem? Because I mean, I'm not gonna allow theology from tradition from the early first century traditions to be able to justify any of the supernatural claims that they have mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and again, I also don't think that necessarily that, hey, these people were just like, I'm just gonna make up, random stuff, put it in the Gospels, throw a block in here, and just say it, call it a day. I think it's more of there was a lot of, I mean, again, there was oral transmission going on, and message spread, and people over time, like Greek storytellers, could have easily wrote what people thought to be the case. But yet, the problem is that again, there is no
Right.
contemporary sources that
I,
are Jewish or
yeah.
Roman
I think the
at the time.
problem is
So.
that I've mentioned many data points at this point that speak to the fact that these go back to the living time of the apostles. And so I just don't think there would have been the room for, some far off, both geographically and in time, Greek writer to be like, let me just, kind of use what's there and add a little fluff. But I'd like to move on to a kind of a different topic, if you would.
Yeah, well, what Jewish or Roman source have you mentioned, or any contemporary sources to justify the traditions that you're mentioning?
Well, there are Jewish and Roman sources that give kind of basic outline things that speak to the truth of like the general picture of the Gospels, like the crucifixion of Jesus, the fact that his followers claimed resurrection, and then his following grew after, the fact that he did miracles. Even the earliest Jewish sources we have are basically an apologetic against Jesus for the miracles that he did. And this is a well accepted fact of historians like, Bart Ehrman, others. They accept that Jesus was a miracle worker in the sense that he was going around and people were claiming healings from the ministry that he was doing. Much like we see modern miracle, like ministries today, whether you think they're real or not, Jesus' first century friends and opponents don't seem to have contested that he was doing miracles. And so
Yeah,
again, we don't
I,
see Roman and Jewish sources saying Jesus
I
rose from the
literally mentioned
dead,
this
but
in the
that would make
rebuttal.
them Christians, right?
I've already addressed what you just said in the rebuttal. You said that again, okay, so you said historians and scholars are widely on their consensus agree upon the crucifixion. I'm fine with saying that. That doesn't
Mm-hmm.
really matter though. It doesn't add
Right.
anything to it. But you talk about a group appear these supposedly these groups such as the apostles claim to have an appearance. There's supposedly an appearance that Jesus had appeared to them after his death, and that's the part where there is no surviving Jewish or contemporary sources that even talk about that. I would love to hear one historian or any scholars that have actually looked into this into the first century that agree with what you're saying, that these group of apostles claim to have an experience of Jesus that that rose from the dead. Because whenever I look up what actually upon scholars and our secular scholars and historians, they don't necessarily agree upon the fact that that these group of
Uh,
people actually said Jesus
okay.
rose from the
I
dead.
think you're very wrong on that one, actually. My understanding is that most agnostic atheist scholars
1 minute.
do think that Christians, like the earliest followers of Jesus, were claiming resurrection appearances. And many of them even go so far as to say that they saw something, but, they'll chalk it up to hallucination or something like you did, which I don't know. I kind of find it interesting that your explanation, for the most part, was like that Peter had a hallucination. Well, I mean, that would be experiencing an appearance of Jesus, right? So, like, it seems like what you're saying is contradictory for those two things. Maybe you can
Except no,
clarify.
no, except it's not a real experience. It's totally a subjective experience. If it's going to be objective, it would be external from his total
Okay, but it
experience. It's
sounded
not a
like you were
contradiction.
saying they didn't even claim appearances a second ago. Is that
No,
not right?
no, Peter. I'm not saying Peter claimed it, but I'm talking about the idea that a group of people that were apostles claimed to have Jesus show up to them after he had died is totally a claim
Well,
that cannot be
Paul
backed up by
Paul is
scholars or
completely a
historians.
contemporary source. He knew the
Okay,
apostles
guys,
claiming
we're
that.
going to have to
He didn't
stop
know.
and move
All right.
on. We're going to move on to cross-examination. We're going to start with the affirmative going against the negative. And what you're going to do is have 8 minutes, and you may interrupt to clarify the individual. Okay. Are you ready, affirmative? I'm sorry. Yeah, affirmative to cross-examine negative?
Yep, I'm ready.
Okay. Your time will start as soon as you start speaking.
All right. Can you name any example of hallucination in any relevant medical or psychological literature that is on par with the nature of the appearance accounts of Jesus in terms of their multisensory nature, their physicality, and their extended time frames?
Can I list any like specifically about the situation? Are you asking like
Any
specifically
example of a
about?
hallucination that is on par with the types of experiences we're seeing in the Gospels with their physicality, their multisensory nature, and their extended time frames?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, wouldn't you mention? Oh yeah, sure. I mean, actually, I could answer that. Um, Let me go ahead and because I actually have that in my notes, thankfully. Um, Let me go to my notes real quick. Okay, yeah. So trying to look at his name. Lob saying Rampa, he had followers who actually claimed to have experiences of him after his death, but yet these are obviously shown to be bereavement experiences over time.
So they were shown to be bereavement. How were they shown to be bereavement experiences?
Well, you could actually look at their DNA testing, and I mean, there's an article on it I could actually recommend to you, where through DNA testing they actually show that a lot of the claims that people make, such as of things that really didn't happen, is
Hmm.
actually shown to be wrong.
Did they have experiences with him that included eating with him?
Eating with them? I'm not sure.
Okay.
I don't think so.
Did they have like long drawn out conversations that would have taken place over the course of maybe 30 minutes where they got new information about theology?
Um, I'm not sure.
Were they able to
Again, I
were they
didn't
able to touch
I
him?
didn't look into their full experience.
Okay. All right, I'm going to
Again, I'm
move
not
on
sure.
then.
I didn't look into yeah, I didn't look into their full
So
experience.
do you believe the tomb was empty?
No.
Okay. How would you explain the mention of women at the tomb if this is a legendary account, seeing as how this would not have been convincing to a first century audience?
Well, again, I don't think that I'm not even convinced of the idea that the ladies supposedly claimed an empty
Right. All I'm
tomb
asking you,
necessarily.
how would you explain the account of the women at the tomb if this wasn't truthful? Seeing as how if someone were to make up an account, it seems they would be unlikely given the status of women and their testimony in the first century. Do you have an
Yeah,
explanation
well,
for that
Greek
if it
story,
was made
yeah,
up?
so through oral, again, through oral transmission and Greek storytelling, throughout decades later writing about this. I mean,
Right, but do you understand that Greek writers as well as Jews had a very low view of women, and so if they wanted to convince anybody, they wouldn't have put them at the tomb. Do you have an explanation for that?
how necessary? What criteria are you basing that off of to say that they wouldn't? Oh wait, sorry. This is your cross-examination.
Yeah. You can ask me that in
So
yours if you want. I'll move on though. So can you give me anything? Oh no, let me move on to this one. Can you give me one example besides the Gospels where in only 30 years a great series of legends, the most prominent elements of which are fictitious, have accumulated around a historical person and become firmly fixed in the general belief of the community that knew the person?
I haven't looked into other stories necessarily.
Okay.
These are all
Um,
based. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. That's fine. Let's see. Oh, how much time do I have? I have 4 minutes. All right. Let's see. I want to ask this one. Do you subscribe to the idea that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence?
Yeah.
Okay. How would you define extraordinary?
Extraordinary in the sense, or I mean, in the sense that it's like violating nature, or it's just completely different from what we naturally observe. It would be beyond natural world, be something that would be
Okay.
something like supernatural in this context of me
Okay.
describing it.
But you would realize that Christians would not explain the resurrection as something violating nature necessarily, because God, who is above nature, would be resurrecting Jesus from the dead. In the sense that it's not as if Jesus just got up from the dead on his own. There was a God who resurrected him.
Except resurrection would be a violation of nature. If a human rose from the dead, that would violate nature. From a
Okay.
brain dead state to being conscious again is a
Yeah.
violation of nature.
I can only ask questions, so I won't. I won't respond, I guess. All right. Do you believe Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did in fact write the Gospels ascribed to them?
Not convinced. No.
Okay. Since early and geographically diverse sources like Papias, the Muratorian fragment, Irenaeus, and Tertullian all attest to the traditional authorship of the Gospels without variation, could you provide any early attestation against traditional authorship?
Yeah, well, how long ago were those written? Real quick, just so I have an understanding of what you're mentioning. Those specific writings that you're describing, how long ago were they written?
Yeah, so Papias would have been toward the very beginning of the 2nd century, and the others would have been in the.
You don't have to answer questions.
Oh,
from
that's
them.
true. That's true. I don't. Yeah, let me just not answer.
Right.
Okay, let me just ask you this: Could
I just
you
wanted to
provide? Thank you for the moderating. Could you
Yeah.
provide any early attestation against traditional authorship?
Can I provide any what?
Early attestation against traditional authorship.
Not necessarily. I mean, I mentioned one of my arguments though, specifically that the Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John. I mean, the apostles, their language was primarily Aramaic, and they weren't influenced in Greek or highly educated in that. So their limitations may have suggested that it's probably the case that they didn't actually write the Gospels.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I was looking at my questions. I think I missed that. Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, my argument against or was suggest that they probably didn't write the Gospels was the fact that they were illiterate, they were fishermen, the apostles, and their primary language was Aramaic, and they weren't very influenced in Greek, and they were limited on their education when it came up to Greek. So that's essentially why I wouldn't accept it.
Okay, well, let me ask one question that kind of leads to that. Are you aware that there was a major
1 minute.
Greek-speaking city that would have likely had major influence over Jesus' hometown within walking distance?
I'm not sure. I mean, maybe there was. I mean, I'm fine saying there was, but I just don't see how necessarily. I mean, I don't know what the contemporary sources would then be that these people that
Let me ask
the
one more
apostles
question,
actually
if that's
attended.
okay. Can you give any reason why later Christians might have invented the names of Mark and Luke for their Gospels, seeing as how these names were not even associated with eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry or resurrection?
Well, it's similar to other gospels that you wouldn't agree with, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure there are gospels that were written later, and I'm sure you would agree they weren't written by those people. I'm not sure if it's like the Gospel of Peter
Right.
or something like that.
You're referring to like the Gospel of Peter, who is a main disciple. What I'm saying is that makes sense why someone would invent the Gospel of Peter. It doesn't make
Okay,
sense to
time
you.
is up.
Okay.
So now we're going to move from cross-examination of negative to affirmative. And we're going to give you 8 minutes as well. And your time will start once you begin speaking.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so what methods do you use to decide if a claim is historically reliable? Under supernatural claims specifically.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I love the distinction of like supernatural claims. I'm not even sure if it's helpful distinction, supernatural and natural. And I think that is kind of falling away a little bit. But I'll say I would prefer to phrase it as unlikely and likely. We all have some idea of just from living regular life, what kinds of things are likely to happen and what kinds of things are unlikely to happen. So we know that people rising from the dead is extremely unlikely, right? But we also have to consider how our prior at least allowance for the possibility that a God exists, right? Or the
Yeah, I don't
possibility
think
that
that was my
miracles are
question.
possible.
I don't think
Yeah,
I
sorry,
don't think that was
ask
my
it
question.
again.
No, yeah, what I'm trying to ask you is what method, like I'm fine, yeah, I agree with you. It's about what's likely and unlikely when it comes out to history. But what I'm wondering is what methods do you use to come to the conclusion whether something is likely or unlikely? Like what's your criteria specifically?
Yeah, I would use historical criteria that you use for anything like multiple attestation, if it's an early account. And these are all things that, like just because something's earlier doesn't mean it's more accurate necessarily in history. But all things being equal, an earlier account is better. All things being equal, it's better to have early or independent attestation, multiple attestation. All things being equal, it's better to have embarrassing details in something like we see in the Gospels. Um, all things being equal, it's better to see the kinds of truth-telling points that I mentioned in my opening statement, whether it's unexplained illusions or like harmonizations between the Gospels, things like that. When we look at these type of things, we can come up with a body of evidence to evaluate how likely something is. Essentially, I evaluate the evidence. Like, of course, I have a prior, I have a notion of how likely something might be, but then I come to the evidence in every case, look at the evidence, and then readjust my thinking on how likely it is now that I've looked at the evidence. Does that make sense? Sorry, that
Okay,
was a question.
so then would you consider eyewitnesses alone as evidence for something? So like or let's just say in general, would you consider eyewitnesses of a supernatural claim as evidence for that claim?
I would consider eyewitnesses of any kind of claim as evidence for that claim.
Specifically, something supernatural. If there was a group of
Yes, I
people
would
that came
include
up to
that
you
in
right,
any kind of
if there,
claim.
if
Yeah.
so if there was a group of people that came up to you right now and said that they had an experience with a God that contradicts yours, you would consider that as actual evidence for that God?
I would consider it as evidence in the sense that I think that evidence is something that makes that position. Let's say the position is that they have, that God B is the true God, right? That their God's God B. If there are people claiming to have experienced him, that is evidence for that God. But evidence might not be evidence for just one thing. It could be evidence for multiple things. You have to look at different theories, see what explains the evidence best. And it's also possible that, I could say,
I
hey,
think
look,
that well,
yeah, sure.
it's a bit different because what I'm talking about is two things that contradict each other, right? A and
Right,
B
right,
cannot be both simultaneously correct at the same time. If
right.
someone let's say if there's a God that contradicts the Christian God,
Hmm.
and has teachings different from your Christian God, whether it's such as Hinduism or any other type of religion that contradicts what it says about the afterlife or anything like that. If they were to claim if there was a group of people that claimed to experience that God, you would then accept that as evidence for the existence of that God?
I would accept it as evidence. It may be weak evidence, and it also may be evidence that that God exists in a lower G form, because in my worldview, there are gods, lower G, that exist that would claim things opposite to my God. So it just would depend on how strong the evidence for their claim is. So I'm not saying it would be strong evidence, but I'm saying it would be some evidence to
So
consider.
then, so then under your own logic, you're basically concluding that your group appearance argument as evidence for the resurrection is only going to be weak evidence as well,
No,
if
because
I'm not
I've
mistaken.
argued for the kind of experiences and the kind of historical reports we have about those experiences. You've left your scenario as just some nebula. You'd have to fill in the details for me on these people that are coming to me. I having gone through the evidence, I think the evidence for what I'm claiming is strong eyewitness. I'm not saying all eyewitness testimony is weak. I'm saying if someone just came up to me off the street and said they had an experience, my first thought would be, okay, that's some evidence, but weak evidence. Tell me more.
What about the Islamic, for example, Muhammad receiving a revelation and there being also oral traditions and stuff like that. I mean, would you accept that as an account for that God or
Um,
evidence?
I'm not sure what you mean, because I mean Muhammad, like him receiving revelations, like the only actual evidence we have of that is that the Quran exists, right? But like, so he wrote a book. I mean, that's the evidence that he received revelations. That's not really particularly good evidence that he received revelations, you know.
That's exactly what I'm doing. The same thing with the Gospels is that the only evidence you have for the claim of supposedly the person seeing this God is the Gospels. That it's essentially the same logic we're applying here. Are we
I
not?
don't think it is, because yeah, in one case, Muhammad is like you're saying that. Sorry, rephrase that for me.
Yeah, so you're basically saying that the only evidence we have for Muhammad experiencing Allah is that the fact that he wrote the Quran, or I mean, he didn't necessarily write the Quran, but if, essentially is the book the Quran, well, I could essentially that's the exact same logic, if I'm not mistaken, that you're
Mm-hmm.
basically saying that the
Mm-hmm.
group
Right.
appearances of them
Right.
experiencing
Okay.
this God is through the Gospels. That's essentially the same
1
logic we're
minute.
applying here.
So yeah, I would say it's different because again, we have to look at the evidence like that we have. Like, so Muhammad went into a cave and he experienced an angel who actually in the Islamic sources themselves harassed Muhammad and kind of beat him up. Muhammad wanted to kill himself after he got done with this angel, and this angel was telling him to recite the Quran. And it was just Muhammad there. No one else, ever saw something happen other than Muhammad falling into a trance. And so I would say that uh, in a sense, it could be that kind of weak evidence, but it's not anywhere close to on par with the Gospels or Paul, who give us very close accounts of the eyewitnesses who had group hallucination, or
And
not
what
group hallucinations.
what strong evidence do you have for the claims of what they made in the Gospels?
What strong evidence do I have for the
Yeah,
claims that they made? What particular
because
claims?
it seems like you're saying
Okay,
the
that
Gospels
is
are.
time. We're moving into final arguments here. You have 5 minutes each. And these are our closing statements. This is a final summary. No new arguments should be introduced. We are going to start with the affirmative closing. You have 5 minutes. Your time begins when you begin to speak.
All right, thanks everybody for joining this debate. Thanks to my opponent and the moderator for setting it up. At the start of the night, I asked you to consider which one of our explanations of the data surrounding the alleged resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth would answer more questions more simply and with less unevidenced assumptions, and which would raise even more difficult questions by attempting to answer the first. So now I want you to answer for yourselves. Was my opponent able to adequately answer the positive evidence I gave for the reliable eyewitness traditions behind the Gospels? Was he able to tell us why legends meant to persuade people to a falsehood would include embarrassing details, or how an author far removed from the time and place in which these events occurred was able to get so many difficult details right, or how these authors would manage to embed signs of eyewitness testimony, such as the increase in Aramaisms that correspond with an increase in the use of personal names, something that would only be discovered with modern approaches to analyzing the Gospels. Was he able to account for the fact that the resurrection was claimed early on by those who were in a position to know the truth? Did he explain how radical legends could accumulate within the lifetimes of the apostles in a community that looked to the apostles as the carriers of tradition? Was he able to offer a theory that explained the data as well as the resurrection? Did he explain the evidence for the appearances to individuals and groups? Did he explain the evidence for the empty tomb? Did he explain the disciples' willingness to die for their belief? Did he explain the origin of the unique Christian belief in the resurrection of one man to glory before the end of time, which ran contrary to Jewish or Greek beliefs of the time? Once again, the simple story that Jesus rose from the dead explains all of this data. Certainly, before looking at the evidence, one may reasonably think that a man rising from the dead is less probable than someone telling a lie or someone having a hallucination. But if we did history by deciding what was most probable before looking at the evidence, we would likely conclude that a great number of unlikely things that we all believe to be true about history had never happened. Considering this, did my opponent rely on the evidence we have, or did he rely on the assumption that miracles are so unlikely that any natural hypothesis should be preferred, no matter how far-fetched? Did he demonstrate that miracles are so unlikely that any natural hypothesis should be preferred, no matter how far-fetched? Did he explain why we should believe this in the face of millions of claims of miracles done in Jesus' name, some of which are well evidenced? Again, I'll leave that to you to decide. Finally, if I have persuaded you that belief in the resurrection may be reasonable, or at least much more reasonable than you thought, I don't want to leave you in the cold, calculating halls of historical inquiry, but I want to go on to invite you to the party by telling you that about the beauty of the gospel, the good news about Jesus, that God, whom humanity's whole effort could be described as trying to reach or become, would come to us not because of what we had done, but only because of how he loved us, died on a cross for us, so that we could be free from our sin, delivered from the devil, reconciled to him, and have eternal life with all the best parts of this one magnified, is an idea that is worth putting all of my hope in and betting my life on. And for the reasons I gave tonight, I happen to think that the odds on that bet are quite good and worth celebrating. But Jesus did not only appear then, he is appearing today to the sinner, self-righteous, the anxious, the depressed, the apathetic, the skeptic, and the doubter, and changing everything. If you don't like your story, I invite you to be part of this one instead. Join the man who flipped the world on its head, who turned this world into a place where we name our dogs Caesar and Nero, but name our children Peter, James, and John. Join the man who split the calendar in two so that we can never go a day without a reminder of him. Join the man who did all of this without hate and without force, but with self-sacrificial love. If life isn't working for you today, ask Jesus to reveal himself for you. My experience is that everything I've come to know, or my experience and everything I've come to know, causes me to trust deeply in his promise that he will. All right, that leaves me with another minute. So thank you guys again. Thanks to the moderator again and my opponent. This was super good, and they did a great job.
Awesome. Cool. All right. I'm going to get you down to... Once again, we're now going to hear from the closing statement from the negative. And you have 5 minutes, and your 5 minutes starts when you start speaking.
All right. Yeah, I mean, before I do read my closing statement, I do want to say one thing. Me and my opponent did have the chance to expand as much as, we didn't have as much time to expand as much as we could have on cross-examinations and open discussions, sadly. Which is a good suggestion for, if anybody here agrees, you could raise your hand on this, but we should definitely expand the time on cross-examinations for next time. But again, this was a first formal debate, so, because it seems like we were about to get somewhere, but then sadly time was up. But it's okay. Suggestions will come in through and see what the audience thinks. Have it like a democracy thing almost. But yeah, let me get into my closing statement. As we come to an end of this debate, let's take a step back and look at the evidence throughout the discussion I've shown. That natural explanations such as grief visions, memory distortion, social influence, and the way stories evolve in communities are far more plausible than supernatural claims. that try to smuggle on an explanation without any historical verification. When we compare explanations, we should follow Occam's razor. The explanation that requires the fewest unnecessary assumptions is usually the most likely. Supernatural claims about the resurrection introduce a whole host of assumptions for which we have no confirmed examples, no independent evidence, no observable mechanisms. In contrast, natural explanations relied on processes we can observe, test, and understand in human history and psychology. We have no background or verified information about resurrection like events in history. So, in evaluating the evidence, it makes sense to trust that what is natural and well documented, rather than a miraculous cause that has no justification for it. Um, in short, the resurrection is not necessary to explain what we observe. Natural explanations fully account for beliefs, experiences, and stories that shaped early Christianity. And when the known, observable, and natural fully explains a phenomenon, there is simply no reason to reach for the supernatural. Another thing is that a lot of the times uh, I'm dealing with plausibility rather than possibility, just to clarify on that too. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have for my closing statement. I mean, there's nothing else I really wanted to say. But I also wanted to, I mean, off closing statement is thanks for my opponent for actually showing up and being able to show up throughout the whole debate. I also want to give thanks to my internet for not giving out on me while this debate was going on. If there would have been 30 people, then maybe that would have happened. But thankfully, only you guys decided to show up for this debate. And I also want to thank the moderator for actually moderating pretty good. I think he did a good job. I think my opponent did a pretty good job. I think it was honestly it was very good. I liked it. So thanks for having me up here, and hope everybody has a great day. Or actually a great night, sorry.
All right. We are now opening for the discussion portion. Audience questions. The rules are you got to raise your hand. I will call on you. One concise question only. No speeches. No follow-up debates with the speakers. And definitely remain respectful. If your question turns to commentary, I'm probably going to kick you. So, Reaper, go ahead and unmute yourself. And who's the question for?
It would be for Collin.
Well, not Reaper.
Can you hear me?
Wait.
Yeah,
No. Wait.
What?
Wait. Elder was raising his hand. Was I saying Collin? Did I say Collin?
You
it was
said
Elder.
Reaper, yeah.
Yeah, you said
Okay.
But yeah, do Elder and then
I'm sorry, Elder. I'm sorry, Elder. I don't know why I called you Reaper. You're just standing right there. You had your hand up. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yes, I did. So my question is for Colin, and it's concerning the resurrection narrative with going to the open tomb and the Romans are sleeping. In Roman culture, in the Roman military rather, sleeping on the job is punishable by death, and it seems very unlikely that it would be the case that Romans would be found sleeping, seeing as their life is at risk. And I could understand maybe one of them and the other one keeps guard and keeps them out of trouble, but even both of them seems even far more unlikely. And it seems to me that the only option you have is maybe saying there's some divine slumber put upon them, but then you're presupposing God again. So how do you reconcile this?
So first of all, I got to help you out because actually the gospel accounts, I'm going to try and make your argument stronger because the gospel accounts don't actually say that the guards were sleeping. This is an argument from the Jews that Matthew is responding to. In the gospel accounts, I believe the angels show up and kind of, KO the guards. And so to make your argument strong, I think I know what you're getting at. Typically, I think the argument that you're trying to make, I believe, is that if it were the case that the guards had been KO'd by the angels and then went back to the Jews to be like, holy crap, they stole the body, and the Jews came up with this idea that they should just tell the Romans that they fell asleep. How likely is that? Because since even that would have been potentially a death sentence. And I think the response to that is easier than what you asked. It's basically just that, well, if this was their only option, and in the heat of the moment, they may have been like, I mean, that's still terrible. Like, I really don't want to go to my commander and tell him I fell asleep on the job, but, that may be the better option here. We just don't know, basically. But slight correction there.
Anyone? Raise hand. Reaper, go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is for Collin as well. I don't know that you provided any justification to essentially overcome the prior probability of effectively 110 billion to 1, considering that if we understand prior probability is going to be based on our understanding of the world naturalistically, then we would say, look, there's been about 110 billion, give or take a couple billion people to ever exist in the world. We've never seen anyone rise from the dead, ever. We've tried to test it, it's never been the case. So the probability is going to be 1 in 110 billion. So how are you overcoming that with just eyewitness testimony, considering that even if you have high eyewitness testimony, you're going to need at least 32 eyewitnesses that are credibly strong and not just, oh, they could have told people?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and it's something I really wish we could have gotten more into the debate, just miracles in general. I would say that from my perspective, I mean, I know nobody's going to agree with this, but I think the historical evidence to me clearly favors the resurrection hypothesis. But I think that even if someone accepted that, they may still have a hard time accepting the resurrection because of what you mentioned, because they may think that the possibility of miracles are so low that they might come to the conclusion, well, I have to add 50 unevidenced natural explanations together to get the same explanatory powers of the resurrection, but I'm going to do it because I think the prior probability of miracles or the existence of God is so low. And to that, I would just say, and I guess I won't take the time to run through an example now, although I had examples prepared. I would just say I think the miracle evidence that we have, particularly for miracles in Jesus' name, there's so many good, well-evidenced miracle claims that I believe that it lowers that prior probability, and as well as do other things, right? Like every worldview is an accumulation of all these different things, like what you think about the origin of life or what you think about the start of the universe. All of these things might factor into your prior probability that there is a God or that miracles are possible. And so hopefully that somewhat answers your question.
Crispy, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I had a question for Cortez.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so if a text was originally written during the time of the events it describes, but the only surviving copy is from a later scribe, is it still considered to be contemporary source?
I think that was a statement, not a question.
No, it's a question at the end. Is it considered to be a contemporary source?
The Gospels? Well, I guess my point is I don't think the Gospels are contemporary since they're written decades later. But I guess my point here is that there is surviving Jewish and Roman sources, but none of them actually describe a resurrection or anything to do with an empty tomb, is what I'm suggesting there.
Okay. I see Bias, and then we'll go Rangos, and then Elder.
Hey, Cortez, listening to you, it sounded like a lot of it had to deal with you not believing in the miracle aspect, which I respect. My question to you is very simple. If the resurrection were true, and if the Bible were true, would you believe and follow Christ according to the Bible?
Yeah, I think I would have no other decision but to believe that the thing is true. Yeah, I would have no other decision but to believe it's true, or else, because then I'm being irrational myself if there's presented evidence. Regarding whether I would follow Jesus, if I'm being threatened with the idea of eternal torment, then I think it would be irrational for me to just send myself to hell. So at that point, I would probably be forced to believe in that scenario, or else I'm gonna go to hell. But if it's like simply, because again, there's different concepts of what hell is. But if it's like simply just a unconscious state, then like there is no actual eternal torment, then I wouldn't follow Jesus or the commandments in the Bible.
Rangos?
Right. Can you guys hear?
Yeah.
Okay. My question is also for Cortez. I noted that it seemed like a lot of your argument relies heavily on the possible reconstruction of memories because things were written decades after the fact. Well, do you consider that if we're able, or you can answer this how you want, if we're able to rely on the testimony of war veterans who have recounted their stories more than 35 years later, um, wouldn't, and these are for things that they've personally, gone through and like traumatic experiences, wouldn't it be just as reasonable to rely on a memory as memorable as someone, coming back from the dead, even if it happened 35 years earlier?
Yeah, under the strictly the analogy that you presented about the veterans, I think it would be again because they were under traumatic events, but the fact that they are, they report what happened. They pretty much report what happened. That these are contemporary reports. If they reported it like decades like after, again, they might have what is true, but ultimately speaking, it's not going to be. Because I'm not saying necessarily, okay, they're wrong because this was, they said it decades after the event, but what I'm necessarily saying is that it's not going to be entirely accurate or trustworthy on what they claim. But if it's like contemporary, then I think memory wouldn't be such a bad thing to rely on if it's like contemporary to the event.
Elder?
Yeah, my question is again for Colin, and this is in consideration to how you qualify evidence. There's been many accounts of people reporting that they've had experiences being abducted by aliens, and in these accounts they have embarrassing details such as being anally probed. Would you qualify the anally probed elements of their stories as being higher credibility to their story being true?
Yes, in isolation, that alone I would consider adds credibility. Any embarrassing detail adds credibility. How much credibility? I don't know. You'd have to look at the other details of the case. But yes, in general, embarrassing details, something that is genuinely embarrassing to a person, not maybe just what we think is embarrassing, because some people could say, hey, this happened to me, and they're not embarrassed. They're just shameless. We have to have some good reason for thinking it is embarrassing to them.
Reaper?
Yeah, my question is for Colin. So if we're looking, because you guys kept saying that the resurrection was a simple hypothesis and that it had less things involved in it, but it seemed to be the case that when you take, Cortez's like naturalistic account of like all that stuff, it doesn't add anything really at all. And it seems your view is the one that is adding this extra ontological stuff of God and all this other metaphysical baggage. How do you overcome that reduction in probability given an extra ontological layer?
Yeah, again, I would say that, his theory doesn't add stuff. It sounds like you mean that in the sense of it doesn't add, some supreme being, maybe. It doesn't add God, right? But it does add things that we don't have evidence for, right? It adds that there, let's say, was that Jesus was thrown into a pit or something contrary to what the evidence that we have, right? It adds that someone in some far-off place wrote about the Gospels contrary to the evidence we have. It adds all sorts of things that ultimately still don't, in my view, explain the evidence as well as my view. And so, in a sense, you could look at the case that I've presented here tonight and take it as a purely historical thing and not add the extra layer to it and simply say, all right, the historical evidence points to that Jesus died on the cross and that, sometime later his followers saw him alive again. You could make that pure historical claim and not answer the question of how that happened. Maybe this is still a naturalistic explanation of that, the stars align, like your cells have this, deep hidden ability to raise you from the dead after 3 days, and it but only happens like, once in a blue moon or something. So you can always come up with a natural hypothesis, but the question is, how complicated is that hypothesis going to be? How well does it explain the evidence? How ad hoc is it? Do you just have to pull things out of thin air, or are they evidenced? So hopefully that answers your question.
Crispy?
Yeah, for Cortez again.
It'll be go Rango and Reaper.
Okay. Yeah, the question for you is, what would have been their motive for the gospel writers to lie about something they claim to witness, rather than their simply reporting their sincere beliefs?
Yeah, I don't think I'm necessarily implying that they didn't promote their sincere belief, or they just casually invented and made this up. What I think I'm trying to say here is that there are, again, it was spread orally, and over time the Gospels were written. And I think from what they hear by other individuals, like spreading rumors, is how they come to the conclusion they believe in this stuff, right? Like they hear from other people through oral teachings, and then that's whenever they try to appeal to the traditions and actually write the Gospels over time, and still have the sincere belief, But it ultimately doesn't give any justification for the supernatural claim that they resurrected. Or I'm sorry, that Jesus resurrected.
Okay, and Rango's?
Okay, my question is for Cortez again. I heard you earlier not so willingly grant that Jesus was actually put in the tomb. What reason do you have to believe that Jesus was possibly not placed into the tomb?
Well, I would just probably say that it's a possibility, but the fact that he there's just no contemporary sources to suggest that. Although there is contemporary sources to like suggest other people that were actually placed in tombs and that were executed, but specifically with Jesus, we just have no accounts of that other than Gospels written decades later. So that's specifically, while I would uphold it a possibility, because there's nothing that makes it just not the case. Although there are, because there's just no, to just answer directly, there's just no contemporary sources that show it to be the case that Jesus was definitely put in a tomb. Comparison, it's more reasonable to say that, hey, there was other people that were placed in tombs that were executed, because there are contemporary sources that actually justify that they were put in tombs. But when it comes up to Jesus, we just don't have any.
Reaper?
Mine's for Collin, of course. So with regard to like my previous question, you mentioned how there's not evidence for like the non-tomb stuff, but like you literally have it in the Antiquity of the Jews, I believe, where they mention that majority of people who were crucified are, either left to the dogs, the birds, or just tossed in mass graves. So we do have evidence for like every naturalistic explanation that you bring up, and you don't need to add like 40 different things. You can just bring one detail that is historically sourced and say, look, all of these are the case. And if we're really just going with like, God as a simple explanation, then we're really just taking into account like all the supernatural explanations, and we're just granting all of them because they're all more simpler in like this just grant God capacity, when we can just accept all these naturalistic ones. And so why would we accept like the God, or why would we just throw out these reasonings for the naturalistic explanations when we clearly have tons of contemporary sources and evidence to justify all of the explanations?
Yeah, I feel like there was a couple questions embedded in there. So let me try to answer what I think you were asking. So you mentioned how Josephus mentions that people were, not often, let's say, buried after crucifixion, and maybe that's true. I'm not sure what source you're talking about. I don't doubt it, but I think that's a good little picture of like, what a couple of your questions have been about, I think, where, maybe we look at a piece of information, like maybe we establish a case that it was much more often the case, let's say, that people were not buried when they were crucified in first century Judea. Let's say that's the case. Well, we would be in danger of doing what is called a priori history if we took that and then said, therefore, Jesus must have been, thrown into a pit. And I don't think that's what you're saying necessarily. But this is a good picture of how we can take that information and say, okay, most people aren't buried in the tomb after the crucifixion. So what evidence do we have that Jesus was, if we're going to believe that? And all the things that I listed that, again, historians typically look at: multiple attestation, early unembellished accounts, Paul, who knew eyewitnesses who said that Jesus was buried, the arguments that I gave from embarrassment, and I won't go through them again, or the historical persons linked with the empty tomb, like Joseph of Arimathea, the women at the tomb, all those things, those significantly raise the evidence level to such a degree that I think it's clear that it overcomes the idea that, well, this doesn't happen all the time, because there are many things throughout history that we would have to conclude didn't happen if we were going to say, only we have to go with the explanation that happens most often, or that happens even a significant amount of the time, because crazy things happen all throughout history. And I think you can blow this up to the question about miracles, and say, yes, like a miracle is at the very least an unlikely event, otherwise it wouldn't be a miracle. But you can add in, for any particular case, you have to still look at the evidence and see if it overcomes that.
Carrera?
I have a question for Colin.
Yeah.
And that being, if contemporary divine experiences attributed to the biblical God were and are empirically verified to this day, what epistemological or institutional barriers are preventing their integration into global academic consensus?
Okay. That's a fancy question. I think I got it. So basically, what's preventing, tell me if this is right or not, so that I'm not responding to something, but why doesn't everyone accept this if it's well evidenced? Is that basically what you're asking?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could approach that from a couple different angles. This is a complex topic, and there's a lot of misconception about it. First of all, I mean, I think personally my opponent is just wrong tonight about some of the things that he thinks about the gospel traditions and how late they are. So obviously, and all scholars, but this is the answer basically, that everybody comes to the evidence with some set of beliefs and assumptions. Christians, atheists, everybody. They come with their own, past experience, what they believe to be true. And so they're going to weigh the evidence, interpret the evidence differently. And that's essentially why you have differences in anything. It's because people are different. And so, I'm not saying that that the evidence for the resurrection forces belief. I'm saying that I think it's more probable than not historically that this happened, at least for the purposes of this debate. So I personally believe that God has, chosen to do things the way he's done them for a reason, that he does not intend to force belief, that he intends, a more organic process, or a process that requires some level of seeking, some level of openness. And to do that, he would have to leave the evidence less than what would be required to force someone to believe. Hopefully that answers your question.
I'll take two more questions. I see Rangos and Elder. That'll be the end of this. So who wants to go first and who wants to go last? Either of you?
I'm good either way.
Go ahead, Rangos. You go. And we'll let
All right, okay.
Elder finish it.
I want to follow up with Cortez on the empty tomb. So you mentioned sources about other people being buried, but not necessarily specifically about Jesus, which sounds like you will have to make an exception for him when it comes to this. I'd like to just mention that when it comes to Judea, the Romans made an exception for the Jews. For example, Jews didn't have to practice worshiping Roman gods. They worshiped their own God alone. Same thing when it comes to burials, because especially during Passover, it would have been desecrating the land to leave bodies out. So it was religious practice for the Jews to bury crucified victims. So, given all this information, is there anything, not just I guess absence or like argument from silence, is there any reason that you have personally for not believing that Jesus possibly was not in the tomb?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's similar to what Reaper mentioned a bit, but there's not everybody was actually put in a tomb. I mean, there was people that were actually left over, that just weren't genuinely put in a tomb. I mean, there was a lot of executed Christians that were put in a tomb, but whenever you're asking me, what reason to not believe that that Jesus wasn't put in that tomb. I mean, again, it's just going to be what I mentioned. I mean, I don't know what other reason or possibility you want me to give you, other than there is no contemporary sources for it. But, I mean, I don't know what specific reason you want me to give you on that. I mean, there are other people who were crucified that didn't necessarily get put in a tomb, although there was Christian executions that were actually put in tombs.
And Elder.
Yeah, so I'm gonna try and package two questions together, real politely. My first one is for Collin on what kind of evidence would you need to go to the point where you don't think it was likely for the resurrection to have been true, and secondly, what assumptions do you make that are required for this to be the case?
Could you explain the second part of the question a little bit more?
Right. So I'm asking if there are any presuppositions that you must first make for this for the argument of the resurrection to be the case.
Okay. Let me answer that first, and then let me ask you what the first part was again. I'm bad at keeping two things in my mind at once. So I guess, the presuppositions you'd have to make are pretty simple. Like, I think you at least have to leave open the possibility that there's a God, and leave open the possibility that, that miracles are possible. Beyond that, there's no presuppositions that I can think of. I'm sure there are other ones maybe, but those would be the main ones. I think that you must at least leave open the possibility to believe. Otherwise, there's no point in debating the resurrection if you don't hold the presupposition that it's possible God exists. It's possible that miracles happen. What was the first part again?
Yeah, and the first question was what evidence or argument would be required for you to concede the argument of the resurrection?
Yeah, that's hard to answer because, like I said, so much of this is cumulative. We're talking about the resurrection tonight, but there's so many other factors of everyone's worldview that plays into what they believe. And so, I can't tell you what would push me beyond the tipping point. I can tell you things that would hurt the case. If the Gospels were written, in 200 or 300, something like that, or maybe even earlier, but still late. If I couldn't be sure that they go back to the apostles, if we didn't have the testimony of Paul, even those types of things would really hurt the case for the resurrection. Now, I may still believe, let's say there's a world where, our historical evidence for the resurrection is bad. And so I'm not going to get up here and have these types of debates because I can't defend the resurrection historically. I may still believe in the resurrection if, let's say, modern miracles done in Jesus' name are particularly convincing to me. But maybe they wouldn't be convincing enough to me if the Gospels and Paul's testimony fell out. I'm just not sure. I'd have to rerun all my beliefs, with updated evidence once something like that happened. So hopefully that gets at somewhat of an answer.
All right, and with that concludes tonight's debate on whether it is likely that Jesus of Nazareth rose bodily from the dead. Thank you to both debaters and their time and preparation, and obviously thank you to the audience for maintaining professionalism well. Good night. This was fun. I enjoyed this.
Yep.
Hey, good job. You did a good job, dude.
Hey, awesome.
Good job, guys.
Right on. Yeah, if anybody